We're swiftly approaching Labor Day weekend, and all across America, folks will be firing up the grill for cookouts, lamenting the end of summer, and likely shopping the weekend sales. Class war will probably be the last thing on people's minds, but it shouldn't be. Today we're going to talk about how Labor Day, the holiday celebrated on the first Monday in September, was born amid violence and unrest over oppressive working conditions. We'll also take a look at books that can help us better understand its bloody past. Let's get into it. On the surface, this seems pretty innocent, a federal holiday to honor and commemorate the working class, and almost everyone gets the day off. But there's some pretty dark history here going all the way back to its inception. Let me explain. The story starts out with workers' unions in the 1800s, during the height of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. The average American worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, just to barely make enough money for a basic living. Even though there were some restrictions in some states, kids as young as 5 or 6 worked in mills, factories, and mines across the country, but they only earned a fraction of their adult counterparts' wages. Most workers, regardless of age, faced extremely unsafe working conditions. They had insufficient access to fresh air, they worked in unsanitary facilities, and they lacked breaks. Labor unions, which are groups of workers fighting to maintain or improve conditions for their employment, first appeared in the late 1700s, but they really started to grow more prominent and more vocal during this time. They began organizing strikes and rallies to protest poor working conditions and to compel their employers to renegotiate hours and pay. In 1882, 10,000 workers took unpaid time off to march from City Hall to Union Square in New York City, making this the first Labor Day. Word spread across the nation, and over the next decade or so, 23 more states had adopted the holiday. In 1886, Chicago Unionists rallied around the movement for an 8-hour workday. Between April 25th and May 4th, they attended meetings and paraded through the streets. On May 1st, 35,000 workers walked off their jobs, with tens of thousands more, both skilled and unskilled, joining them on May 3rd and 4th. They traveled from workplace to workplace, urging other workers to strike along with them. While the strikes were said to be peaceful, police clashed with the strikers at least a dozen times, and 3 of those had shootings. That's when all hell started to break loose. Anarchists called for a protest meeting at the West Randolph Street Haymarket, and the leaflets advertising it called for revenge. So the crowd got together on the night of the 4th, and again were stated to be protesting peacefully. The mayor was in attendance that night and instructed the police not to disturb the protest, but after one speaker urged the crowd to throttle the law, shit popped off. 176 officers stormed the meeting, and a protester hurled a bomb at the police, killing an officer instantly. So police drew their guns, started firing wildly, and in the end, 60 officers were injured and 8 died. It's still unknown how many protesters were killed or wounded. After the riot, the mayor banned meetings and processions, and police made picketing impossible while also suppressing the radical press. Less than a decade later, we saw unrest in a company town in Chicago called Pullman. Company towns are places where practically all stores and housing are owned by one company that's also the main employer. In this case, that was engineer and industrialist George Pullman. The Pullman factory made luxury rail cars, and when the economic depression hit at the end of the 1890s, Pullman made the decision to cut wages by almost 30%. Employees in the company town were in the same boat as a lot of other workers in Chicago at the same time, but the key difference is everywhere else, while wages were cut, prices also fell. George Pullman refused to reduce the rent that his employees paid and refused to lower prices in his stores. So in May of 1894, employees decided to strike, and while a few organizations tried to mediate and bring both sides to a resolution, Pullman remained stubborn, to the point that he wouldn't even meet with the strikers. The mayor of Chicago, John Hopkins, loathed Pullman, so even though there was widespread suppression after the Haymarket riot, the police did very little to quell the unrest of this strike. So it grew. The American Railroad Union said that they would no longer work on trains that included Pullman cars, and that brought railroads west of Chicago to a standstill. 125,000 workers across 29 railroads walked off the job as a result. Replacement workers were hired, but strikers would gather in front of the trains to stop them from moving or throw pieces of coal and rocks and wood at them. Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, sent in federal troops city by city to break the strikes and to get the trains running again. But violence raged as troops clashed with the strikers, leaving 30 people dead as a result. Just days after federal troops brought down the bloody strike, Cleveland signed the Labor Day holiday into law. More than 100 years later, we find ourselves in the midst of another type of labor fight. The Great Resignation is an economic trend that's been on the move for about 20 years, and in early 2021, we saw workers quit their jobs in droves for better pay, more autonomy, and more flexibility. And that last one is a really big deal because now there's a number of big companies and entire countries introducing a 4-day work week. Not only that, but we've started to see unions back on the rise.
Well, Apple is one of the latest companies to have some store employees in North America unionized.
Hundreds of Google workers are taking a historic step in Silicon Valley by announcing the creation of a union.
We went for the top dog because we want every other industry, every other business to know that things have changed. We going to unionize. We're not going to quit our jobs anymore. You know, this is a prime example of what the power that people have when they come together.
Performers at Medieval Times in Lyndhurst, New Jersey just voted to unionize.
I couldn't believe that last one. I'll leave a link down in the description to a video from Vox explaining the rise and fall and rise again of unions. We didn't even have enough time to talk about how the early labor unions were rife with sexism and racism, but again, I'll leave links down in the description for you to take a peek at later because now we need to talk about books. There's 2 here that we can read that I think will give us all a broader understanding of all of this. A History of America in 10 Strikes and The Edge of Anarchy. A History of America in 10 Strikes by Eric Loomis recounts the history of American labor and the strikes that resulted from companies' mistreatment of workers. Each chapter focuses on a different strike, followed by a section about the broader related issues in American society. He touches on the women laborers in the mills of Massachusetts who fought terrible factory conditions in the 1830s. Continuing chronologically to explore slaves who organized and walked off of plantations and withheld their labor from masters who increasingly could not control them. Loomis moves all the way into the modern era and includes tales like how Reagan smashed the union of the air traffic controllers who actually served as his own employees. The last book is The Edge of Anarchy by Jack Kelly. The book goes into detail about the Pullman strike and everything that's a part of it. Kelly closely scrutinizes the roles of all parties involved. Pullman, obviously, who died of a heart attack 3 years after the riots, by the way. The American Railway Union, which played the biggest role, but also state, local, and federal officials, the courts, the press, activists, and laborers. Absolutely no one comes out unscathed. What I think is the most interesting is the description of how government actually worked in that era. It's kind of a peek behind the curtain of Cleveland's administration at the time. So while we may have traded in working class rebellion for burgers, beach weekends, and Bud Lights, that doesn't mean that the fight for workers' rights has completely come to an end. Remembering Labor Day's origins can not only help us celebrate all that the labor movement has achieved, but also help us recognize the continued need for radical activism.